In an interview this past Sunday, Donald Trump again goaded Canada, calling the neighbor to the north the 51st state again. Canada, whose prime minister, after attending the AI summit here in Paris, in Brussels this Wednesday, where the president of the European Council and the European Commission talked up closening ties and their bid to ratify the CETA free trade agreement with Ottawa. Justin Trudeau, who made it clear that Canada is looking to deepen ties in the face of a hostile Trump administration that is slapping new tariffs on steel and more.
We will be working with the American administration over the coming weeks to highlight the negative impacts on Americans and Canadians of these unacceptable tariffs. But we'll also be working with our international partners and friends. And if it comes to that, our response, of course, will be firm and clear.
That was Trudeau just before he left for Brussels. We heard more of the same at a press conference that was given a short while ago. Let's cross to Brussels and correspondent Dave Keating. Canada drifting away from the United States and closer to Europe?
Yeah, I mean, what's interesting is this visit to Brussels was kind of a last-minute addition to Prime Minister Trudeau's visit to Paris on Monday and Tuesday of this week for the AI summit. We just learned last week that he'd be coming to Brussels as well, and the intention is quite clear. Both the EU and Canada are the targets right now of the United States for both Trump's military threats and his economic threats. Of course, he tried to impose a 25% blanket tariff on Canada last month before walking that back, giving a 1-month reprieve. He's talked about the U.S. annexing Canada, making it the 51st state. And meanwhile, he said the European Union is next in his trade war. And also, he's made threats to annex Greenland, a territory of an EU member state. So right now, the EU and Canada have a lot in common in that they are being targeted by Trump. And so clearly this was an attempt to kind of coordinate the response here. Now, coming into this meeting, both Trudeau and the EU leaders were keen to stress the benefits of the CETA free trade agreement that partially went into effect in 2017. They pointed out that there's been a 66% increase in bilateral trade since that took effect in 2017. And they said that that's the way for progress and for prosperity, not trade wars, but rather trade pacts. Also coming out of this, they put out a joint statement saying that they both remain committed to the rules-based international order, the UN Charter, and the inviolability of borders. Now, that's clearly aimed at the United States. So this was supposed to be a show of solidarity between Canada and the European Union as they're both in the same boat being targeted by the United States. But this comes in the context as well of deepening EU-Canada relations, particularly with their free trade agreement. However, it still needs to be completely ratified by all national governments of the European Union, and they are dragging their feet.
Yeah, dragging their feet, particularly under the pressure of farmers' unions. Dave Keating, you mentioned a joint statement. Now, usually our viewers' eyes glaze over when we read these joint statements when there's high-level meetings like this. But on Tuesday at the AI summit, the joint statement, a rather bland one, talking about an inclusive artificial intelligence, signed by Canada, not by the UK.
Yes, I'm told that did not go unnoticed by Canada. It was kind of an odd series of events. So it emerged that the United States government would not sign this final declaration because it made a reference to, quote, inclusive and sustainable artificial intelligence. Apparently, the Trump government thought that had to do with DEI or something like that. But in the end, the UK decided also to not sign that final declaration, but they can't seem to explain why. What seems pretty clear is that they were afraid that signing it would offend Donald Trump because they haven't really offered any other explanation for why it was only them in the US that decided not to sign it. And this comes in the context of an overall souring of relations between Canada and the UK, because the UK is in a difficult position here because Donald Trump has said, oh, maybe the UK can be exempt from my tariffs, maybe not. And so Prime Minister Keir Starmer has clearly made the choice to keep his head down, not to be expressing solidarity with Canada over the trade war or with Denmark over the threats to Greenland, and not try to upset Donald Trump in any way. But that is hurting the UK's alliances, both with Canada and with Europe. And so what I think we're seeing here is Canada drifting closer to the European Union and further away from the United Kingdom, which of course it was part of just 40 years ago, technically. And so that's quite an interesting development. I think that the UK in the short-term interest here is keeping their head down to avoid the tariffs. In the long run, this could be doing serious damages to alliances. And this type of thing that we saw today with the European Union could be a sign that deepening Canadian-EU ties will come at the expense of Canada-UK ties.
Dave Keating, stay with us. We're going to cross to Boston. James Boyes is visiting research fellow at the Center on U.S. Politics at University College London. Thank you for being with us here on France 24.
Thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be back.
What was this about? Because, we expected perhaps that if there was still a Tory government in the UK, they might follow the US's lead and not sign this joint statement on an inclusive AI. But from a Labour government?
Yeah, I'm sure you won't be surprised to learn that Sir Keir Starmer is not the first, nor will he be the last British Prime Minister to find himself in something of a pincer movement between Washington and Brussels. Where will he place his ultimate allegiance, effectively? You're absolutely right that one might imagine a Labour administration would, and indeed are, far more comfortable dealing with their colleagues across the English Channel. The challenge they face, however, is formidable because, of course, 5 years ago, the British public voted to leave the European Union in the Brexit vote. So if he gets too comfortable with Brussels, he faces a backlash from the potential British electorate at any future elections. Likewise, he realizes the significance of trade, defense, historical alliances with the United States, and singularly does not want to alienate Donald Trump. The problem with that, of course, is that the Trump administration will see a Downing Street administration led by and populated by politicians who have been vocal in their antagonism of Donald Trump over the last 4 or 5 years, an administration which is about as far out of step with their own MAGA agenda as can be. And it's notable, of course, that Sir Keir Starmer has not been invited to the White House, has not been the first foreign leader to visit the new president, as has so often been the case with other British prime ministers.
And James, you heard Dave Keating talk about it there. Is there strain within the Commonwealth? After all, the EU standing by Canada, but they want to hear perhaps Britain stand by them as well?
Yes, and you would imagine that would be an all too obvious route to occur. The Commonwealth has historically been of great significance to successive British administrations, and they have used it as a way of perpetuating British influence around the world. I think Dave's point about Keir Starmer keeping his head down, to quote Dave Keating, was actually spot on. I think that's exactly what he's trying to do. I think he's trying to sort of take the rather easy way out of this and think, well, if I sort of stay here and keep quiet, maybe nobody will notice that we aren't doing or saying anything. Of course, that hasn't gone unnoticed, as the report rightly pointed out. At some point, he will need to make a stance. And at this point, I think he's trying to have the best of both worlds and can end up with the worst of all possibilities.
Dave Keating, you mention it. Justin Trudeau not going to London on this trip. Now, it should be said, Keir Starmer did come to Brussels and meet with EU leaders, first British Prime Minister to do so since 2019. How would you compare the visit last week by Keir Starmer and this visit by Justin Trudeau?
Well, it was awkward, I think, because Starmer is very, very hemmed in by the red lines that he set himself, which are essentially the same red lines that Boris Johnson set. So, he was there for the dinner with EU leaders. By all accounts, we heard it was not super warm and not unfriendly by any means, but not, they didn't sense this openness. What we're hearing here in Brussels and from European capitals is that they have an increasing sense of pessimism that anything will change with this Labour government compared to the previous Conservative government. This reset in relations hasn't really yielded anything, again, because of these red lines. Now, some of that we've heard from the UK government side is a bit due to delays and changes in administration. But the overall, there's real pessimism about whether he's really going to change the relationship.
On this point, James Boyes, could Donald Trump, in the end, push the UK back towards closer relations with Brussels?
I don't think he'll need to. I think you've got an administration in Downing Street which, if it had a free vote, would very clearly be very happy to rejoin the European Union. It has gone out of its way to basically play nice with the EU. It can only go so far, of course, because of the declared statement of the British electorate. But I think that many people who voted for Brexit will be fearful of what it is that Keir Starmer and his government are doing and will no doubt continue to do to chip away at those safeguards. And although the red lines that Dave rightly refers to are in place, I think many people in the UK will be fearful of this, and this will increase, I'm sure, the support for the reform movement, for Nigel Farage. And I think you'll see this borne out in poll after poll, which indeed now show, in many cases, reform to be ahead of an increasingly unpopular Labour administration.
At the end of the day, though, what we saw in Brussels, is it just a photo op? Canada can't replace its relation with the United States.
No, it cannot. And what is fascinating, of course, is to consider how they're going to respond to Donald Trump. Donald Trump is engaging in an extreme form of coercive diplomacy in an attempt to stem the flow of fentanyl and illegal immigrants across the northern border. There's a lot of focus, understandably, on the problems that this country faces from the southern border. But the administration, I think, is very much trying to clamp down on those problems coming from Canada. They don't believe they're doing enough. And getting into a tit-for-tat war with tariffs with Donald Trump, I think, is certainly no way to solve the problem and will increase the problems manyfold, both upon the government in Canada, and I'm sure the pressure to increase tariffs further here in Washington, D.C. in the days and weeks to come.
And Donald Trump, who loves tariffs, the European Union, again, talking up the concept of this free trade agreement that, as Dave pointed out, some are balking at within the EU.
Yeah, well, the problem you've got, of course, is that these negotiations have been going on for years. People have been talking about a transatlantic free trade agreement since at least the days of John Major, and we still do not have one in place. There was lots of talk about an alliance between the United Kingdom and the United States after Brexit. That has not come about. Neither is there obviously one in place with the European Union. We talk about tensions between Washington and European capitals, but of course, when Joe Biden was president, he made it very, very clear that he had no interest in prioritizing a trade relationship with London, and that set back negotiations substantially. So it will be interesting to see what transpires under this Trump administration, which, despite Donald Trump's use of tariffs in his first days and weeks in office, is ultimately a trading negotiation in an attempt to get better deals for American citizens, American government, and American entities, which, of course, is his priority as the American president.
All right, and one final question, just I guess it's happening as Canadians kick off an election campaign of their own. Trudeau is a lame duck prime minister. He won't be running again. There seems to be, though, national unity for now over how to handle Europe and how to handle the United States.
Yes, and I think that Donald Trump will be pleased to see the back of this administration. Whether he may end up wishing for the devil he knew, one can only surmise at this point. Very clearly, what his actions have done is to cement any dissent within the Canadian populace into a strong growing anti-American sentiment. We're seeing that, for example, with regards to moves to buy Canadian, to reject American goods and services. There have indeed also been occurrences where meetings were due to happen in the United States, and you've seen business leaders balking at the idea of traveling south and indeed insisting upon meetings occurring in the Canadian territory. So the extent to which this starts to impact American businesses will be particularly telling for an administration, which of course is looking to bolster the American economy and not do anything to hinder it. And this, of course, could indeed place that effort in all kinds of trouble.
I want to thank you so much for joining us from Boston, James Boyes. I want to thank our correspondent, Dave Keating, in Brussels.